Welcome to Industry TV Network. Hit the like button, share, and subscribe. This is part 4 of Rick James, and this highlights his journey towards Motown. The first task the band had taken on when quitting Colin Kerr was to rid themselves completely of their minor bird costumes, as well as the birds themselves, and to dress instead like Rick's idols, the Rolling Stones. The only thing they kept was the band's feathered name. Then, already aware from their previous forays into Eaton's that its well-heeled owner John Craig Eaton was interested in musical groups, they solicited and received his financial backing and used it to buy more and better equipment. Entrepreneur Eaton loved owning the minor birds and gave them Newt Rockney-like pep talks from time to time. He also didn't seem to mind when band members would barge into his office and ask him for more money. In fact, he often gave it to them. Occasionally, he even let the group crash at his mansion in Toronto's upper-class Bridle Path neighborhood. But Eaton didn't really want to dirty his hands by getting too deeply involved in the music business, and asked a neighbor of his, Morley Shellman, to actually manage the band. The Minor Birds' final accomplishment was to lure more and better musicians into their lineup. In February 1965, Bruce Palmer, a bass player who later found fame with Buffalo Springfield, joined the group. Shortly thereafter, Rick noticed folk singer Neil Young performing in a Toronto coffee house. Rick was impressed that Young had composed his own songs and that he was accompanying himself with an acoustic guitar and a harmonica a la Bob Dylan. Rick had been thinking that the band needed a folk singer to add to its versatility, so he asked Young to join. Soon, Rick and Young became roommates in a Toronto apartment where, according to Jimmy McDonough's book Shaky, Neil Young's biography, Young and Rick lived on baked goods that Rick would pilfer from delivery trucks in the wee hours of the morning. Palmer and Young worked well with Rick, and Young used Eaton's largesse to buy himself a Rickenbacker 6-string electric guitar to replace his old folk-style 12-string semi-acoustic model. Rick claimed later that he had convinced Young to make this switch, telling him, "Come on, man, forget this acoustic guitar and let's plug in." Young was torn between two camps, the rockers, who used electric guitars, and the folkies, who stuck with their acoustic models. But Rick provided Young with something to help him forget the tensions he was suffering from, poppers. As Young told another of his biographers, John Enerson, he and Rick used to pop amyl nitrates before going on stage and walk on just killing themselves, laughing and rolling around from these things. On at least one occasion, this habit interfered with Young's ability to play. At a high school gig, Young jumped off the stage, inadvertently pulling his guitar plug out in the middle of a song. The audience was surprised to see Young play the rest of the song on his silent guitar, apparently still hearing the music playing at full volume via the drugs circulating through his system. Young gave up poppers a short time later, but most of the duo's appearances together were terrific. McDonough quotes Comrie Smith, a friend of Young's, who said she watched what Smith called a show-stopping performance by Young and Rick on the song Hideaway. She said Neil would stop playing lead, do a harp solo, throw the harmonica way up in the air, and Rick would catch it and continue the solo. Levi Ruffin was one of many people in later years who heard Rick's stories about playing with Neil Young and associating with superstars like Joni Mitchell and Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, but never quite believed what he heard. Rick used to tell us a pack of lies, Ruffin notes. One day, however, he and Rick were having lunch, and we were sitting there, and here comes Neil Young, and he kept calling him Ricky, and they were hugging, and Rick says, "This is Levi Ruffin," and Levi, "This is fucking Neil Young." Both Palmer and Young were still in the band's lineup when, in 1965, they accompanied Rick to Detroit on his first attempt to start his Motown career. Morley Shellman had met the actor and vocalist Sal Mineo while Mineo was in Toronto to film the Gene Krupa story. Shellman sensed a future for a white band fronted by a talented black vocalist and asked Mineo if he could help get the group an audition at Motown Record Corporation headquarters in Detroit. In 1965, Motown was near its all-time peak and was besieged by struggling artists and groups, but Mineo was a big name in the movies. To add to his clout, his 1957 tune, "Start Moving in My Direction," one of two he had recorded that year, had risen to number 9 on the Billboard pop chart, earning him a gold record. Given his fame, he had no trouble reaching Motown executives. Those executives asked for a tape of the Minor Birds, then invited them to visit Detroit for an audition. This was a major milestone in Rick's life. From his earliest days, he had thought about being a Motown artist. Few black artists in America or Canada hadn't. And now, a band he led had been invited to audition for the legendary Detroit Company, the largest and most successful black-owned record company ever established in America. The Minor Birds performed for vocalist Smokey Robinson and Motown president Berry Gordy and passed their audition, becoming only the fourth, mostly white band ever signed by Motown Records. The previous 3 all-white groups, the Rustics, the Dalton Boys, and the Underdogs, did not score any hits while with the company. Minor Bird Neil Merriweather thought one reason Motown was willing to sign Rick's group was that everyone at Motown was going crazy over Vanilla Fudge's new version of the Supreme song, "You Keep Me Hanging On." Vanilla Fudge, as the name implies, was an all-white group, and their version of the song had reached number 6 on the pop chart, but it was released by the Atlantic Recording Corporation, not by Motown. Soon Motown would sign a 5th white group, Rare Earth, who would score several hits for the company. Motown created a new subsidiary label named Rare Earth that began releasing other white groups. They, Motown, were experimenting with all kinds of things, Rick said later. "I guess they could associate with our band more easily because of me being black and in the group." After their initial visit, the Minor Birds went back to Canada. They returned to Detroit in January 1966 to begin work on an album and stayed there about a week. Motown immediately put the Minor Birds to work. "We were in a Motown studio all the time we were in Detroit," band member Rickman Mason complains. "We were driven to compose and record. Get it done. That's what Motown wanted." Although the company put them under what Mason calls an overseer while they slaved away, he gives Motown points for assigning white Canadian R. Dean Taylor to the job, matching the ethnicity and nationality of all the band members except Rick. Taylor, then working as a Motown vocalist, songwriter, and producer, later became well known when his song "Indiana Wants Me," released on Motown's Rare Earth label, reached number 5 on the U.S. Billboard pop chart and number 1 on the Canadian pop chart in 1970. Mason claims he and the others worked so hard he's not even sure how many records they made. He says he remembers creating 4 tunes, but adds, "We may have made an album. I don't know." Billboard magazine reported the group recorded 4 tracks in January and planned to return to Detroit the next month for more. But Mason's confusion is understandable because the band members mostly worked on instrumental tracks, which Motown producers later put together with vocals recorded by others. This was a Motown specialty. In other words, the band members all played on the Minor Birds cuts, but then individual members of the band worked independently on instrumental tracks that were to be used by other bands. In keeping with the separation ethos, Motown never offered the Minor Birds a contract as a group. Instead, the label offered each member of the band a separate 6-month contract, which each gladly signed. Neil Young groused years later that the contracts gave Motown 100% of each other's artist publishing rights, standard Motown practice during that period. But neither he nor anyone else complained at the time. Instead, they swiftly signed the contracts and went right to work. Mason says it was great fun working at Hitsville, the name emblazoned on a huge sign on one of the several former residences that comprised Motown headquarters on Detroit's West Grand Boulevard. During their time off, Rick, who had been progressing in his drug use, turned Merriweather onto acid. But he did not do so blithely. He watched me like a hawk after I dropped the acid, Merriweather says. He was a very caring guy. Rick told author David Ritz that around this time, he also fell in love with doing speed. While Rick's drug use grew, his interest in women, which would become almost compulsive and all-consuming later in his life, remained relatively undeveloped. Merriweather says that when he and Rick were about to leave their hotel room one evening, 2 young women knocked on their door and indicated they wished to visit with the 2 musicians. Merriweather says he expressed enthusiasm, but Rick threw some drugs and told me, "They'll be here when we get back." He was into his career, his image, and being a rock star. While the band members labored to write and record at Hitsville, numerous Motown greats walked in and out of the studio, listening, giving advice, singing on some of the tracks, and finishing some that the band members had left unfinished. Among them were the songwriting trio Holland Dozier Holland, brothers Brian and Eddie Holland and Lamont Dozier, Smokey Robinson, vocalists Tammy Terrell and Junior Walker, the Four Tops, the Temptations, and Berry Gordy himself. Neil Young told author Nelson George in Where Did Our Love Go? If we needed something, or if they thought we weren't strong enough, a couple of Motown singers would just walk right in and they'd Motown us. If somebody wasn't confident or didn't have it, they didn't say, "Well, let's work on this." Some guy would just come in who had it and do it. In his autobiography, Waging Heavy Peace, Young said Motown even fitted the Minor Birds for non-bird-like costumes and sent them for training at the company's famed choreography school, then run by Charlie Atkins, an accomplished dancer and choreographer. Morley Shellman told Billboard the group would return to Detroit in April 1966 for more sessions. With an album in sight and talk of a U.S. tour upcoming, the band members definitely improved their musical skills during their stay in Detroit. Mason notes, for instance, that when the band left Toronto, he himself was just a mediocre drummer, but after I spent that week at Motown, people kept asking me, "Did you take lessons?" Unfortunately, however, much of what the band actually produced in Detroit was never released and may be lost forever. None of the tunes the band recorded there were released until 2006, when Universal Motown, Motown's successor company, released a 5-CD package containing 127 tracks made by Motown artists in 1966. The package was part of the company's complete Motown singles series. Among the 40-year-old songs in the package were the Minor Birds' It's My Time and Go On and Cry, both featuring Rick's vocals, which originally had been scheduled for release as the A and B sides of a single on Motown's VIP label in the spring of 1966. The single was withdrawn just before its scheduled release due to legal issues with Rick. In 2012, the tune saw the intended release as the A and B side of a limited edition 45 RPM record on Universal, bearing original style Motown VIP labels. Singing It's My Time, Rick's voice is harsh and rhythmic drumming dominates the tune. It's a poor attempt at a Stones imitation. Rick called the record The Four Tops Meet the Loving Spoonful, a combination of soul and folk rock. Although Neil Young has claimed co-authorship of the song with Rick, in 2012, Motown identified the writers of the tune as Rick under the name Ricky James Matthews, plus Motown staffers Ardeen Taylor and Michael Valvano. Go On and Cry is a very effective, soft ballad backed with Spanish-type guitar licks. Rick's vocal is sensitive and empathic. Motown credited the song to Rick, the band's rhythm guitarist John Taylor, Valvano, and Ardeen Taylor. Harry Weinger, Universal Motown's artist and repertoire chief, says that the company still holds only 2 other unreleased songs containing Rick's vocals, I Got You in My Soul and I'll Wait Forever, the former resembling a Rolling Stones up-tempo rock and blues composition with harmonica, on which Rick imitates Mick Jagger. The latter is also very Stones-ish. John Taylor's widow, Carolyn, has said that to have separate songwriting contracts signed by Rick and her late husband, all dated January 18, 1966, for 3 still unreleased songs not mentioned by Weinger: We Gotta Go, Don't Change Your Mind, and Pretty Words. After the Minor Birds had finished their first week of work at Motown in January and returned to Toronto, Rick became annoyed, as he later told David Ritz that Morley Shellman had never given him his share of the Motown advance money and kept stalling Rick when he asked for it. The two men began a vociferous argument that ended with Rick punching out Shellman. Shellman had his revenge when he informed Motown that Rick was a fugitive from American naval justice and that federal warrants had been issued for his arrest. This made Motown nervous. Gordy had seen the feds go after record companies for the illegal payments they were making to disc jockeys in the 1950s and early 60s in what became known as the payola scandal, and had become sensitive about his relations with the government. Whenever his accountants would approach him with a tax avoidance scheme that might or might not be approved by the IRS, for instance, he was always told them to forget it and pay as much as necessary to keep the IRS off his back. Influenced by this philosophy, Motown executives told Rick that after he'd cleared up his legal problems, they'd be happy to have him and his band back at Motown, but that none of the tunes the band had recorded so far would be released. Motown didn't want to turn the federal government against them by releasing a tune on which the lead singer was a fleeing federal felon. This devastated Rick and his band. They had lost what had seemed like a heaven-sent opportunity to become Motown recording artists. And for Rick personally, the situation soon got much worse.